Henry VIII, the King Who Changed England Forever, Part 1. England before Henry VIII in the summer of 1485, on a muddy field near the town of Market Bosworth, the fate of England changed forever. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, fell in battle against Henry Tudor, a Welsh nobleman with a tenuous claim to the English throne. Richard's death ended more than 3 decades of brutal civil conflict, known as the Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic struggles between the rival houses of Lancaster and York that had torn England apart and decimated its nobility. Henry Tudor, now Henry VIII, understood that his hold on power was fragile. His claim to the throne rested on a combination of distant Lancastrian blood, military victory, and parliamentary recognition. To strengthen his position, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the warring houses through marriage. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were symbolically merged into the Tudor rose, but the wounds of civil war ran deep. Henry VII spent his 24-year reign consolidating royal authority and restoring stability to a kingdom exhausted by conflict. He ruthlessly suppressed potential rivals, rebuilt the royal treasury through careful financial management, and avoided expensive foreign wars whenever possible. The king created an effective bureaucracy, enforced law and order through institutions like the Court of Star Chamber, and negotiated marriage alliances with European powers to secure England's position in a continent dominated by France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. By 1509, England had achieved a remarkable transformation. The country was at peace, the royal treasury was full, and the threat of renewed civil war had receded. Yet England remained a secondary power in European politics, overshadowed by the great continental kingdoms. The Catholic Church exercised enormous influence over spiritual and temporal life, with the Pope in Rome holding ultimate authority over religious matters throughout Christendom. Monasteries owned vast estates, bishops wielded political power, and church courts operated alongside royal courts, creating a dual system of justice. This was the kingdom that Henry VIII inherited. Stable, solvent, and at peace, but also traditional, deeply Catholic, and acutely aware of the fragility of the Tudor claim to England's throne. *** Sources used. *** The Tudors by G.J. Mayer. Pages 4367 Henry VIII by J.J. Scarisbrick. Pages 318 The Oxford History of Britain edited by Kenneth O. Morgan. Pages 312-327 Henry VIII by David Starkey. Pages 1529 Part 2, Childhood, Education, and Becoming King Henry was born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, the second surviving son of Henry VIII and Elizabeth of York. Unlike his older brother Arthur, who was groomed from birth to be king, young Henry enjoyed a childhood relatively free from the intense pressures of royal succession. Contemporary accounts describe him as a vigorous, athletic boy with reddish-gold hair, and a commanding presence even in youth. His education was exceptional by any standard. Henry VIII ensured that his sons received instruction from some of England's finest scholars. The poet John Skelton served as one of Henry's tutors, and the young prince studied Latin, French, and some Italian. He developed a genuine passion for theology, music, and mathematics. Henry became an accomplished musician who could play multiple instruments, composed songs, and took pride in his intellectual abilities. The Venetian ambassador later described him as extremely well-read in theology and able to debate complex religious questions with scholars and clergy. The athletic training befitting a Tudor prince occupied much of Henry's time. He excelled at hunting, jousting, archery, and tennis. These were not mere pastimes but essential skills for a nobleman in an age when physical prowess demonstrated fitness to rule. Henry grew tall and powerfully built, standing over 6 feet in an era when the average man was considerably shorter. Everything changed in April 1502 when Prince Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle, probably from sweating sickness, just months after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. At 11 years old, Henry became heir to the throne. His father, ever cautious about the succession, kept the young prince under close supervision, limiting his public appearances and controlling his activities. Arthur's death created a diplomatic dilemma regarding Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish alliance was valuable, and her substantial dowry had already been paid. After years of negotiation, a papal dispensation was obtained allowing Catherine to marry her deceased husband's brother, despite biblical prohibitions against such unions. The marriage was agreed upon, but Henry VIII delayed the actual ceremony. When Henry VIII died on April 21, 1509, the 17-year-old prince became Henry VIII. Within weeks, following the counsel of his father's advisors who wished to maintain the Spanish alliance, Henry married Catherine, who was nearly 6 years his senior. The coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on June 24, 1509, with elaborate ceremonies celebrating the new reign. The young king's accession was greeted with genuine enthusiasm. After years of Henry VII's cautious, sometimes harsh rule, England welcomed a young, vigorous monarch who loved pageantry and promised a more generous, open style of kingship. The scholar Thomas More wrote that the new reign brought hope that this day is the limit of our slavery, the beginning of our freedom. Henry quickly demonstrated his difference from his father by executing Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, the financial ministers whose aggressive tax collection had made them deeply unpopular. Early in his reign, Henry presented himself as a Renaissance prince, learned, athletic, pious, and generous. He patronized scholars and artists, participated enthusiastically in tournaments, and involved himself actively in the administration of his kingdom. Yet most historians now recognize that even in these early years, Henry displayed characteristics that would define his later reign. A conviction of his own righteousness, sensitivity to challenges to his authority, and an ability to rationalize his desires as moral necessities. *** Sources used. ** Henry VIII by J. Scarisbrick. Pages 1935 Henry VIII by David Starkey. Pages 3058 The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir. Pages 5578 Letters and Papers, Foreign and Domestic, of the Reign of Henry VIII, Volume I. Numbers 2082 Anglica Historia by Polydore Virgil, pages 201-215 Part 3. The King's Great Matter by the mid-1520s. Henry VIII faced what he perceived as a catastrophic problem, the succession. Catherine of Aragon had endured multiple pregnancies, but only one child survived infancy, Princess Mary, born in 1516. The Queen had suffered several miscarriages and stillbirths. Her last pregnancy occurred in 1518, and by 1525, she was approaching 40 and unlikely to bear more children. The lack of a male heir threatened everything the Tudors had built. England had never been successfully ruled by a queen regnant, and the memory of civil war remained vivid. Henry believed that without a son, the kingdom would descend into chaos after his death. This was not paranoia but a reasonable fear based on England's recent history. Henry's concern about the succession intertwined with his growing attraction to Anne Boleyn, a young woman serving in the Queen's household. Anne was not conventionally beautiful by the standards recorded in contemporary accounts, but she possessed sophistication, wit, and intelligence gained during years at the French court. Unlike many women at court, Anne refused to become the king's mistress, insisting that their relationship could only proceed within marriage. By 1527, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was invalid and had never been legitimate in God's eyes. He focused on the biblical passage in Leviticus that prohibited a man from marrying his brother's wife, arguing that the papal dispensation that had allowed the marriage could not override divine law. The fact that Catherine's first marriage to Arthur had been consummated became crucial to the theological argument, though Catherine consistently denied this had occurred. Henry believed his case was strong and expected Pope Clement VII to grant an annulment relatively quickly. Popes had previously accommodated similar requests from powerful monarchs. However, Henry's timing was catastrophically poor. In 1527, troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had sacked Rome, and the Pope was effectively Charles's prisoner. Charles was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and vehemently opposed any action that would bastardize his cousin Mary and dishonor his aunt. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister and Lord Chancellor, worked desperately to secure the annulment. Wolsey had risen from relatively modest origins to become the most powerful man in England after the king, accumulating ecclesiastical offices including the Archbishopric of York and serving as papal legate. His wealth and power were extraordinary, yet his position depended entirely on the king's favor. A legatine court convened in England in 1529 to hear the case, with Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio presiding. Catherine made a dramatic appearance, kneeling before Henry and proclaiming the validity of their marriage and her virginity at the time of their wedding. She then walked out and never appeared again, appealing directly to Rome. Campeggio eventually adjourned the court without reaching a verdict, referring the case back to the Pope. The failure destroyed Wolsey. In October 1529, he was stripped of the Lord Chancellorship and charged with praemunire, exercising papal authority in England in derogation of royal authority. He died the following year while traveling to London to face charges of treason, reportedly saying, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." By 1529, it had become clear that the Pope would not grant the annulment while under imperial pressure. Henry faced a choice: abandon his quest to marry Anne Boleyn and secure a male heir, or find another way to resolve what had become known as the king's great matter. The impasse would lead Henry to challenge the authority of the Pope and ultimately transform England's religious and political landscape in ways that few could have anticipated in that year. Sources used. Henry VIII by J.J. Scarisbrick, pages 163–221. The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir, pages 154–198. Henry VIII by David Starkey, pages 259–312. The Life and Death of Cardinal Wolsey by George Cavendish, pages 80–179. Letters and Papers, Foreign and Domestic, of the Reign of Henry VIII, Volume IV, numbers 3913–5795. Part 4. The English Reformation between 1529 and 1534. Henry VIII engineered a revolution in English religion and governance. Unable to secure papal approval for his annulment, the king gradually assembled the legal and theological arguments for royal supremacy over the English Church. This transformation was not primarily about Protestant theology. Henry remained theologically conservative throughout his life, but about power, jurisdiction, and the king's conviction that he answered to God alone, not to any earthly authority including the Pope. Thomas Cromwell emerged as the chief architect of this revolution. A former lawyer and merchant who had served Wolsey, Cromwell possessed a genius for administration and legislation. Unlike Wolsey, who had sought accommodation with Rome, Cromwell pursued a radical solution, severing England's ecclesiastical connection to the papacy entirely and establishing the king as supreme head of the church in England. Parliament became Cromwell's instrument for implementing this transformation. A series of acts passed between 1529 and 1534 progressively restricted papal authority in England. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, passed in 1533, declared that England was an empire, governed by one supreme head, and that no appeals could be made to Rome in ecclesiastical matters. This act provided the legal framework for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's ecclesiastical court to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1532, was a genuine religious reformer with Protestant sympathies, though he carefully concealed the extent of his theological evolution from the king. In May 1533, Cranmer's court declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Days later, he validated Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The Act of Supremacy, passed in November 1534, formalized the break with Rome by declaring the king to be the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. This was not merely a jurisdictional change, but a fundamental restructuring of authority that had profound implications for English society. Royal supremacy meant that the king, not the pope, controlled ecclesiastical appointments, determined doctrine, and received revenues previously sent to Rome. Those who refused to acknowledge royal supremacy faced severe consequences. Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor and one of Europe's most respected scholars, refused to take the oath accepting the Act of Succession and royal supremacy. After more than a year imprisoned in the Tower of London, More was tried for treason and executed in July 1535. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, met the same fate. Their executions shocked Catholic Europe and demonstrated Henry's determination to enforce compliance. The dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1536 and continued through 1540, represented the most dramatic material consequence of the break with Rome. Commissioners appointed by Cromwell visited religious houses throughout England, ostensibly to investigate corruption and moral failings. Their reports, which modern historians recognize as often exaggerated or fabricated, provided justification for closing the monasteries and seizing their considerable wealth. Initially, only smaller monasteries were dissolved, but by 1539, the campaign extended to all religious houses in England and Wales. Approximately 800 monasteries, friaries, and convents were closed. Some 15,000 monks, nuns, and friars were pensioned off. The Crown acquired approximately 1/4 of England's land, along with treasure, plate, and buildings. Much of this wealth was quickly sold to fund Henry's military campaigns and lavish spending, enriching a new class of gentry and nobility whose interests became tied to maintaining the religious changes. The dissolution transformed the English landscape physically and economically. Monastic buildings were demolished or converted to private use. The social services that monasteries had provided, hospitals, schools, care for the poor, were disrupted or eliminated. The redistribution of monastic lands created new landowners who benefited from the Reformation and would resist any attempt to restore papal authority. Popular resistance to these changes erupted in the Pilgrimage of Grace, a major rebellion in northern England in 1536. Beginning in Lincolnshire and spreading to Yorkshire and other northern counties, the rising attracted perhaps 30,000 participants at its height. The rebels demanded restoration of the monasteries, removal of Cromwell and other reformist ministers, and return to traditional religious practices. Robert Aske, a lawyer, emerged as one of the movement's leaders. Henry responded with a combination of conciliation and ruthless suppression. The Duke of Norfolk negotiated with the rebels, making promises that Henry subsequently broke. When a second rising occurred in 1537, the king ordered severe reprisals. Aske and other leaders were executed, and approximately 200 participants were hanged, including abbots and monks. The rebellion's failure demonstrated that Henry would tolerate no challenge to royal supremacy, regardless of popular sentiment. The English Reformation, as implemented by Henry VIII, was distinct from the Protestant Reformation spreading across Europe. Henry rejected Luther's theology and maintained traditional Catholic practices including clerical celibacy, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and auricular confession. The 6 Articles, passed in 1539, reaffirmed these conservative doctrines and prescribed severe penalties for those who denied them. Protestant reformers and Catholic recusants alike faced persecution during Henry's reign, as the king insisted on obedience to his unique version of religious settlement. *** sources used. Henry VIII by J.J. Scarisbrick, pages 241–387. The Tudors by G.J. Mayer, pages 195–247. Henry VIII by David Starkey, pages 344–412. Letters and Papers, Foreign and Domestic, of the Reign of Henry VIII, Volumes VI, ZI. The Cambridge History of Britain, Volume 2, pages 423–459, Part 5. The Six Wives and Court Politics. Henry VIII's 6 marriages were not merely personal affairs but political events that shaped English history. Each marriage reflected shifting alliances, the ongoing succession crisis, and the complex dynamics of Tudor court politics. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, endured 24 years of marriage before being cast aside. Daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine was intelligent, pious, and dignified. She had served as regent of England during Henry's absence in 1513, demonstrating administrative competence. Her refusal to accept the annulment and her insistence on the validity of her marriage earned her considerable public sympathy. After the break with Henry, she lived in increasingly reduced circumstances at various residences, forbidden to see her daughter marry. She died in January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle, maintaining until the end that she was Henry's true wife and England's rightful queen. Anne Boleyn's rise and fall occurred with stunning rapidity. Her marriage to Henry in January 1533 had precipitated the break with Rome. Anne was intelligent, politically engaged, and supportive of religious reform, but she failed in her essential duty, providing a male heir. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne suffered at least 2 miscarriages. By early 1536, Henry's passion had cooled, and Thomas Cromwell saw an opportunity to remove a queen who had become a political liability. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was thin, consisting largely of testimony from court musicians extracted under torture and interpretations of innocent conversations as proof of adultery. Nevertheless, Anne was tried, convicted, and executed on May 19, 1536, by a French swordsman brought to England for that purpose. Her final speech on the scaffold praised the king and accepted her fate with remarkable composure. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, a quiet, conservative woman from a gentry family. Jane had served both Catherine and Anne, and her family had opposed religious reform. Unlike her predecessors, Jane successfully produced a male heir. On October 12, 1537, after a difficult labor lasting 3 days, she gave birth to Edward. The kingdom erupted in celebration, but Jane died 12 days later, probably from puerperal fever. Henry genuinely mourned her and later requested burial beside her at Windsor. The king's 4th marriage, to Anne of Cleves, was a diplomatic arrangement intended to create an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany against potential Catholic enemies. Thomas Cromwell negotiated the marriage, relying on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein. When Anne arrived in England in January 1540, Henry found her physically unappealing. He complained privately about her appearance and claimed he could not consummate the marriage. The political situation had changed, making the German alliance less necessary, and Henry wanted out. Anne of Cleves proved sensible and pragmatic. She agreed to an annulment in July 1540, accepting a generous settlement including properties and an income. She remained in England on good terms with the king and outlived all of Henry's other wives. Her compliance saved her life but contributed to Cromwell's fall. The minister who had arranged the disastrous marriage was arrested, attainted by Parliament without trial, and executed on July 28, 1540. On the day of Cromwell's execution, Henry married Catherine Howard, a young woman of about 19 or 20. Catherine was a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, leader of the conservative faction at court, and her family hoped she would influence the king toward religious conservatism. Catherine was vivacious and charming but indiscreet and possibly unfaithful. Evidence emerged in 1541 that she had been sexually involved with Francis Dereham before her marriage and had conducted an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, after becoming queen. The revelations devastated Henry, who had genuinely believed Catherine loved him. She was arrested in November 1541 and executed in February 1542, along with Culpeper and Dereham. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose guilt remains doubtful, Catherine Howard's indiscretions are well documented in contemporary sources, though whether they constituted adultery or merely premarital sexual activity has been debated. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, married the king in July 1543. She was 31, twice widowed, and genuinely interested in religious reform and humanist learning. Catherine served as a capable regent during Henry's absence in France in 1544 and helped reconcile the king with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. She also encouraged the education of Prince Edward and the princesses. Catherine's Protestant sympathies nearly proved fatal in 1546 when religious conservatives, including Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, convinced the king that the Queen was dangerous. Articles were drawn up against her for heresy, but Catherine, warned in time, apologized and submitted entirely to Henry's judgment, claiming she had only debated theology to distract the king from his pain. Henry, mollified, forgave her. She survived to become the wife who closed Henry's eyes when he died, later marrying Thomas Seymour, and dying in childbirth in 1540. The succession question that had driven Henry's marital adventures was ultimately resolved not through multiple wives but through parliamentary statute. The Act of Succession of 1544 placed Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth in the line of succession, the order in which they would eventually reign. However, the act retained the provision that the king could alter the succession by his will, demonstrating that even late in his reign, Henry insisted on maximum personal control over his kingdom's future. Sources used. The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir. Pages 122–584 Henry VIII by J.J. Scarisbrick. Pages 348–445 Henry VIII by David Starkey. Pages 532–631 Letters and Papers, Foreign and Domestic, of the Reign of Henry VIII, Volumes X. XXI Chronicles by Raphael Holinshed, pages 825–847, Part 6, Later Reign, Personality and Death by the 1540s. The vigorous young king who had ascended the throne in 1509 had transformed into an obese, suspicious, and increasingly tyrannical monarch. A jousting accident in 1536 left Henry with a leg wound that never properly healed, causing chronic pain and limiting his mobility. Contemporary accounts describe an ulcerated leg that required constant treatment and produced a foul smell. His waist expanded dramatically. Armor made for him in 1540 suggests a waist measurement of approximately 54 inches. Henry's health deteriorated throughout his final decade. In addition to his leg problems, he suffered from what may have been type 2 diabetes. He experienced periods of severe illness when his death seemed imminent, followed by partial recoveries. The constant pain likely contributed to his increasingly erratic and brutal behavior. Executions, which had always been features of Henry's reign, accelerated in his final years. Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, the Earl of Surrey, and the Duke of Norfolk, saved only by Henry's own death, all fell victim to the aging king's suspicion and rage. Despite his physical decline, Henry remained actively engaged in foreign policy and warfare. His ambitions in France and Scotland consumed vast resources during the 1540s. In 1542, he renewed war with Scotland after the disastrous English defeat at Haddon Rig was avenged by victory at Solway Moss. The Scottish King James V died shortly after, leaving his week-old daughter Mary as queen. Henry attempted to arrange a marriage between Mary and Prince Edward, leading to the conflict known as the Rough Wooing, when Scotland resisted English pressure. Henry's final war with France began in 1543. The king personally led his army to France in 1544, despite his physical condition requiring him to be transported in a specially constructed litter. The campaign captured Boulogne but achieved little else and cost enormous sums. The treasury that Henry VIII had carefully accumulated was completely exhausted. To fund his wars, Henry debased the coinage, selling monasteries' lands and treasures, creating inflation and economic disruption. Religious policy in Henry's final years remained characteristically contradictory. The king burned Protestants who denied transubstantiation while executing Catholics who refused to acknowledge royal supremacy. In 1546, Anne Askew, a Protestant gentlewoman who denied the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, was tortured and burned. Weeks later, the Catholic preacher Edward Powell was hanged for refusing the oath of supremacy. This willingness to persecute both religious extremes reflected Henry's determination to enforce his own doctrinal settlement, which accepted neither papal authority nor Protestant theology. Court factions competed intensely during these final years, knowing that the succession of 9-year-old Prince Edward would create opportunities for whoever controlled access to the young king. The reformist faction, led by Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, competed against religious conservatives led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner. Henry's final months saw the reformists gaining advantage, partly due to the king's friendship with Catherine Parr, who favored reform. In December 1546, Norfolk and his son the Earl of Surrey were arrested. Surrey was executed on January 19, 1547, for displaying royal arms that suggested a claim to the throne. Norfolk was attainted and sentenced to death. Scheduled for execution on January 28, Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547, at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. According to contemporary accounts, he died with Archbishop Cranmer at his side, reportedly squeezing the archbishop's hand when asked to give a sign of his faith in Christ. His death was kept secret for 3 days, while the reformist faction secured control of the government. Edward Seymour, the young king's uncle, moved quickly to establish himself as Lord Protector. Norfolk's execution warrant remained unsigned on Henry's desk, and he was spared, remaining imprisoned in the Tower throughout Edward's reign. Henry's will, which may have been partially forged or altered, established a regency council but gave special powers to Hertford, soon created Duke of Somerset. The king was buried at Windsor Castle beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his longed-for son. The funeral was conducted with elaborate ceremony befitting England's most powerful king. Henry had planned an enormous tomb surpassing his father's, incorporating the tomb originally built for Cardinal Wolsey, but it was never completed. Today, a simple marble slab marks his burial place. Contemporary assessments of Henry varied dramatically. The Protestant reformer John Fox later portrayed him as a heroic defender of English independence from Rome. Catholic writers depicted him as a tyrant and murderer. Edward Hall's Chronicle, written during Henry's reign, praised the king's magnificence and achievements. Foreign ambassadors' reports provide more balanced assessments, describing a king who was intelligent, charming when he wished to be, suspicious, ruthless when opposed, and absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. *** Sources used. ** Henry VIII by J.J. Scarisbrick. Pages 446–532 Henry VIII by Robert Hutchinson. Pages 198–247 Henry VIII by David Starkey. Pages 630–689 Letters and Papers, Foreign and Domestic, of the Reign of Henry VIII, Volumes XIX. XXI Hall's Chronicle by Edward Hall, pages 863–876. Part 7. Legacy and Historical Importance. Henry VIII's 38-year reign fundamentally transformed England in ways that continue to shape the nation. The religious revolution he initiated, though driven primarily by personal and dynastic concerns, rather than theological conviction, permanently altered England's relationship with Catholic Europe and established a religious settlement that eventually evolved into the Anglican Communion. The break with Rome and establishment of royal supremacy represented a decisive assertion of national sovereignty. By rejecting papal authority, Henry established the principle that England was an independent empire, governed by its own laws and institutions without reference to external powers. This principle would influence English and later British political thought for centuries, shaping attitudes toward foreign intervention and national independence. The dissolution of the monasteries created profound social and economic changes. The redistribution of perhaps 1/4 of England's land created a new class of landowners, whose prosperity depended on maintaining the religious settlement. This made a complete restoration of Catholicism increasingly difficult with each passing year, as those who had profited from monastic lands had no interest in returning them. The dissolution also eliminated institutions that had provided social services, contributing to increased poverty and social dislocation in the later 16th century. Constitutionally, Henry's reign witnessed both the expansion of royal power and the growing importance of Parliament. The king used parliamentary statutes to implement the break with Rome, establishing the principle that fundamental changes to England's religious and political structure required parliamentary approval. While Henry dominated his parliaments, the precedent that such momentous changes required parliamentary consent would have profound implications for later constitutional development. The succession question that had obsessed Henry was ultimately resolved, though not as he had hoped. Edward VI reigned for only 6 years before dying at 15. Mary I then ruled for 5 years, attempting to restore Catholicism and burning approximately 280 Protestants in the process. Elizabeth I, the daughter Henry had once bastardized, reigned for 45 years and established England as a major European power. The irony that Henry's most successful heir was a woman, the very outcome he had struggled so desperately to avoid, was not lost on later historians. Henry's impact on English culture extended beyond politics and religion. His court was a center of Renaissance learning and artistic patronage. He attracted scholars, musicians, and artists to England, though the break with Rome isolated England from some European cultural currents. The English language Bible, though more fully developed under his son, began to take shape during Henry's reign, eventually becoming central to English Protestant identity and literary development. Modern historical assessment of Henry VIII has evolved considerably. Victorian historians often portrayed him as a heroic national figure who freed England from Roman tyranny. Catholic historians emphasized his cruelty and violence. 20th-century scholarship, beginning with A.F. Pollard's biography and culminating in J.J. Scarisbrick's magisterial work, has sought to understand Henry within the context of 16th-century assumptions about kingship, honor, and religion. Contemporary historians recognize Henry as a complex figure, highly intelligent and well-educated, yet capable of extraordinary self-deception, generous and charming when secure, but ruthlessly vindictive when threatened. Genuinely pious according to his own understanding of Christianity, yet willing to execute those who disagreed with his interpretation. David Starkey and other recent biographers have emphasized how Henry's personality, his need for validation, his conviction of his own righteousness, his sensitivity to challenges, shaped English history. The debate over Henry's responsibility for the English Reformation continues. Some historians argue that he was manipulated by advisors like Cromwell and Cranmer who had genuinely reformist agendas. Others contend that Henry controlled policy throughout, using subordinates to implement his will while maintaining plausible deniability. The evidence suggests that while Henry relied on skilled ministers, he made the fundamental decisions himself and ruthlessly disposed of those who failed him or outlived their usefulness. Henry's personal life has often overshadowed his political achievements in popular culture. The drama of 6 marriages, the executions of 2 wives, and the larger-than-life personality have made him perhaps the most recognizable English monarch. Films, television series, and novels have portrayed Henry as everything from romantic hero to brutal tyrant. While these popular portrayals have brought Henry's story to wide audiences, they have often simplified or distorted the historical reality, reducing complex political and religious conflicts to personal drama. The king's legacy is ultimately contradictory, reflecting the contradictions of the man himself. He expanded royal power yet strengthened Parliament. He broke with Rome yet remained theologically conservative. He sought stability through a male heir, yet his most successful successor was his daughter. He ordered the deaths of thousands yet maintained genuine popularity throughout most of his reign. He transformed England's religion, culture, and politics, yet died believing he had merely restored ancient rights wrongly usurped by papal pretensions. Henry VIII remains historically important not because he was admirable. Moral judgments on such a distant and different figure are ultimately anachronistic, but because his actions had profound and lasting consequences. The England that emerged from his reign was fundamentally different from the kingdom he had inherited. Protestant rather than Catholic, increasingly assertive of its independence, governed through a partnership of crown and parliament, and embarked on a path that would eventually make it a major European and global power. Whether these changes justify the suffering he inflicted, the lives he destroyed, and the violence he employed remains a question without a definitive answer, but their historical significance is undeniable. *** Sources used. ** Henry VIII by J. Scarisbrick. Pages 533–580. The Tudors by G. Mayer. Pages 425–462. Henry VIII by John Guy. Pages 423–478. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Henry VIII entry by J. Scarisbrick. The Cambridge History of Britain. Volume 2. Pages 498–537. Henry VIII by David Starkey. Pages 690–724.